Just moments ago, in a move that stunned both the palace and the public, King Charles signed a private order that would shake the very foundations of royal tradition. Camilla's entire family stripped, erased, and discarded from every royal privilege they once enjoyed. No one could have predicted the thunderous silence that followed the sealed doors of Clarence House that morning. Beneath the grandeur of royal chandeliers, amid the echoes of protocol and centuries-old hierarchy, something irreversible was set into motion. At the center of it stood King Charles, not the monarch of pageantry, but the man, the father, the husband who had carried a storm inside him for far too long. And on this fateful day, that storm found paper, ink, and a wax seal that would alter royal history forever. The decision wasn't made lightly. According to palace insiders, an emergency meeting was called at dawn. A trusted few, only those whose loyalty had been tested by fire, were summoned to a discreet chamber within Clarence House. What was discussed inside remains officially undocumented, but whispers speak of betrayal, interference, and a desperate need to restore order within the monarchy's fragile inner circle. And when the king emerged, he was not the same man who had entered. His face pale, his eyes swollen from tears, and in his hand a single envelope containing the decree that would erase every privilege previously extended to the Parker Bowles bloodline. Those watching closely described the moment as eerily quiet. No formal announcement, no traditional press briefing, just the eerie disappearance of names and access, like ghosts fading from the royal ledger. Camilla's family, once permitted to attend exclusive events, benefit from royal protection, and operate in spaces once considered sacred to the monarchy, were just like that locked out, erased. Royal staff who had been present at previous public functions with Camilla's children and grandchildren noticed the omission before the media even caught on. Their names, previously printed beside royal dignitaries on seating plans and guest lists, were conspicuously missing. One palace aide referred to the moment as an act of surgical precision, as if the monarchy had cut away a diseased limb to save the body. This wasn't sudden. Insiders suggest tensions had been escalating for weeks, possibly months. Every quiet exchange between King Charles and Prince William, every look exchanged across the palace corridors between Princess Anne and Camilla, suddenly made sense in hindsight. The coldness, the avoidance, the silence before the strike. What the world perceived as unity at royal events was nothing more than a well-staged performance, hiding the looming fracture. Now, royal commentators are calling it more than a fallout. They're calling it a purge, a symbolic cleansing of the monarchy from the influence of those deemed unworthy, even if by blood they were not true heirs. The decision has ignited debate not just about Camilla's family, but about the future identity of the crown itself. Is this the first step toward a leaner, bloodline-only monarchy? Or is it simply a personal reckoning, years in the making, finally unleashed? But while the ink was still drying on the order, Camilla's reaction behind palace walls sent shockwaves that were anything but silent. She had weathered countless storms before. Criticism, scandal, whispers in the press, Camilla had faced it all and survived. But nothing could have prepared her for what had just unfolded behind the gilded doors of Clarence House. The Queen Consort, once hailed as the steadfast backbone beside King Charles, now stood stripped of control, gasping for clarity as the walls of royal power crumbled around her. The moment the decree was confirmed, something inside her broke. Eyewitnesses describe an eruption rage laced with disbelief as Camilla stormed through the palace corridors, her voice echoing through stone and silence. "You can't do this to my family!" she reportedly screamed, her voice shrill, shaking with betrayal and desperation. The fury wasn't theatrical. It was volcanic, raw, and terrifying to those who had never seen her come undone. She tried to reach Charles, tried to force a private meeting that same hour, but he had already ordered the doors to be closed literally and metaphorically. Sources close to the palace reveal he refused to see her. Not out of anger, but out of finality. That decision had already been made. There would be no second discussion, no reconsideration. It was a line drawn not just in paper and ink, but in legacy and power. And Camilla knew, in that moment, she had lost something far greater than access or privilege. She had lost the leverage she had so carefully cultivated over decades. Inside her private quarters, Camilla collapsed into a chair, her body trembling. A long-serving staff member, loyal since the earliest days of her royal journey, tried to console her, but the queen consort could barely speak. Her breath was ragged, her eyes swollen with tears, and her hands trembled as she reached for the phone. With shaking fingers, she called her son, Tom Parker Bowles. The message she gave him was fragmented but clear. "It's all gone, Tom. They've taken everything." Witnesses say her panic was unlike anything they had seen from her before. It wasn't just the loss of comfort, it was the humiliation, the exposure, and the irreversible shift in royal loyalty. By late afternoon, reports began to swirl of broken glass in one of the private rooms and a senior aide handing in their resignation. Rumors suggest the confrontation that followed Camilla's breakdown turned so volatile, the staff was ordered to keep their distance. Security was discreetly reinforced, not because of a threat from outside, but to manage what had erupted within. The queen consort, now isolated and emotionally fragile, had become a liability in her own palace. It was no longer about her public image, it was about her inner collapse. But beneath the layers of emotional unraveling, another truth was quietly surfacing. Camilla's meltdown wasn't just rooted in pain, it was born from fear. A political fear, a strategic nightmare. She knew this wasn't simply about punishing her personally. This was an orchestrated blow meant to dismantle the very structure she had built around herself. Her children, her grandchildren, her carefully placed allies were the real targets. And now, they were being excised like unwelcome guests at the royal banquet. Her legacy wasn't being questioned, it was being erased. But this wasn't just about Camilla. It was about the people she brought into the monarchy's inner circle, and why Charles was finally ready to purge them all. For years, the Parker Bowles name had been quietly stitched into the fabric of royal affairs, never formally titled, yet ever present, lingering like a shadow just behind the thrones. Camilla's ascent to queen consort didn't just elevate her, it lifted her entire bloodline. Tom Parker Bowles and Laura Lopes, once barely recognizable to the public, suddenly found themselves treated like unofficial royals. Doors opened, invitations arrived, and within palace walls, their influence swelled. Tom, a respected food critic in his own right, became an all-too-familiar face at royal events, offering unsolicited advice on hospitality, wine pairings, and even staffing. Royal insiders whispered that he often acted as though his mother's crown extended to his own shoulders, directing palace staff with the air of authority few dared challenge. Meanwhile, Laura Lopes, the quieter of the two, was navigating her own path through high society with art galleries and curated events that subtly leaned on her royal adjacency. Her endorsements and exhibitions, once humble, began to skyrocket in value. Invitations to her shows were no longer sent based on artistic merit, but on political connections. Gallery owners close to Kensington Palace began complaining in hushed tones. Her art was not the problem, the perception of power was. It became clear that her last name and her mother's new position were influencing doors that should have remained impartial. But no one dared speak aloud what everyone knew. The Parker Bowles family had learned to weaponize proximity. As the public began to take notice, trouble stirred in places far more dangerous than the tabloids. Whispers of backdoor financial dealings tied to family-linked trusts surfaced quiet, cautious allegations that funds tied to royal events and partnerships were somehow overlapping with private ventures. Nothing concrete, nothing proven, but enough to raise eyebrows within the Crown's financial watchdogs. The overlap between public resources and private benefit had grown too wide to ignore, and the growing suspicion began to cast long, ominous shadows. Then came the backlash. As Tom and Laura's presence became normalized in taxpayer-funded spaces, particularly during royal tours and charitable events, the public began to murmur. What were they doing there? Why were they being photographed beside legitimate heirs like William and Catherine? Social media fanned the flames. Royal freeloaders became a phrase thrown around online, and the once subtle family influence began to look like unchecked entitlement. The monarchy, already walking a fragile tightrope between tradition and modern relevance, now faced accusations of nepotism, and Camilla's family was at the center. But beneath the public noise, far more troubling was the private tension this caused within the palace itself. Prince William and Princess Catherine were reportedly disturbed by the growing power of non-blood relatives, individuals who had not sworn oaths, who had not endured the pressures of the throne, yet who were profiting off its glow. William saw it as an invasion. Catherine, fiercely protective of her children's future, saw it as a threat to the purity of the royal bloodline. And while they said little publicly, their discomfort grew louder in private until it reached a boiling point. Even Queen Elizabeth, it's whispered, had expressed private concern during her final months. Though she had accepted Camilla publicly, those close to the late Queen suggest she never fully embraced the Parker Bowles extension. It wasn't personal, it was principle. The monarchy, she had always believed, must be kept sacred, not diluted by associations born of convenience. And now, as her legacy came under threat, those left behind were forced to draw a hard line. But if the royal court was boiling with resentment, one voice became louder than all: Prince William, who finally gave his father the ultimatum no king could ignore. What began as quiet resentment had now grown into an undeniable storm, and Prince William was no longer willing to sit in silence. He had watched, for months, maybe years, as the influence of Camilla's family crept into the royal bloodstream like a slow, poisonous leak. At first, it was subtle, an invitation here, a patronage there, but as their power swelled, so did William's unease. The monarchy, to him, wasn't just a birthright. It was a sacred obligation, carved in bloodlines, tradition, and the legacy of a mother who had given everything only to be betrayed by history. And now, he stood at the gates of that legacy, watching it corrode under the quiet entitlement of outsiders. It had to stop. And so, in the shadowed corridors of Windsor Castle, he summoned his voice. The meeting was held in complete secrecy. No aides, no courtiers, just three figures who knew the crown better than anyone: King Charles, Prince William, and Princess Anne. It was there, in the very halls where monarchs once made war and peace, that William laid down the ultimatum that would alter the course of the modern monarchy. According to insiders, he didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. His words were steady, unshaken, unapologetic. "They must go," he said to his father, "or I will." The room reportedly fell into stunned silence. Charles, still grappling with the emotional wreckage of Camilla's breakdown, was blindsided. He had expected resistance from William, perhaps even a plea for boundaries. But not this. Not the threat of abdication, not from his firstborn, his heir, his legacy. William wasn't speaking as a son anymore. He was speaking as a future king. And his message was clear. The monarchy cannot serve two bloodlines. You're either royal by birth, or you're not royal at all. Charles, torn between personal loyalty and institutional duty, hesitated. This wasn't just a matter of privilege, it was a matter of power. Stripping Camilla's family would invite humiliation, internal fracture, and possibly public backlash. But doing nothing risked something even worse, the slow death of legitimacy. And William knew it. He looked at his father, not with anger, but with quiet resolve. The same resolve Diana once had when she walked alone through a minefield for the world to see. He wasn't fighting for himself. He was fighting for a monarchy that had nearly lost its soul once and would not survive losing it again. And then came Anne, the ever-loyal daughter, the silent general of the crown. She spoke a few words, but her stance was absolute. She stood with William. She always had. Her loyalty wasn't swayed by emotion or title. It was grounded in principle. The monarchy must endure, she said. And it must be respected to survive. Her voice was calm, but it carried the weight of history. What William had done in that moment wasn't just demand the removal of a family. He drew a line in the marble floors of Windsor, a line that said, "This is where the future begins." And it will not be rewritten by those who were never meant to hold the pen. Behind his words was the haunting presence of Diana's memory, the legacy that had long been manipulated, polished, or ignored. William was done watching. He wasn't just protecting his inheritance, he was defending hers. This wasn't politics anymore, it was personal. Charles knew what he had to do, but the fallout from that decision would not only break a family, it would ignite a political storm. The decree was signed in silence, but its consequences thundered through the monarchy with the force of a royal earthquake. As headlines blared about the removal of Camilla's family from official privilege, few realized the deeper, darker truth buried within the document. Because beneath the diplomatic language and constitutional formality, one clause, subtle yet devastating, sent a chill through every corner of the royal institution. It didn't just revoke privilege, it mandated erasure. Not just of access, but of memory. A full-scale royal purge. a total and deliberate cleansing of Camilla's bloodline from the palace's past, present, and future. The clause, hidden near the bottom of the decree, made no mention of names. It didn't have to. It was drafted with surgical intent, designed to outlive headlines and survive scrutiny. It forbade any future entitlement of Camilla's relatives, her children, her grandchildren, her wider kin to ever again hold titles, honors, or claim to royal housing. That meant no more invitations to state dinners, no more appearances on royal balconies, no more presence in palace wings once considered extensions of their domestic life. They weren't being removed. They were being erased. Within minutes of the decree becoming active, palace staff received encrypted instructions. Access badges were revoked. Royal drivers were told to stand down. Security details were reassigned or terminated entirely. Events in the upcoming calendar were revised overnight, with Camilla's relatives quietly removed from all guest lists. The family that once dined beside the king was now, by law and command, not welcome on the palace grounds unless under strict private conditions. This was no symbolic gesture. It was a scorched earth declaration. But it didn't end there. In the following days, a quiet operation began across royal archival departments. Photographs of Tom Parker Bowles and Laura Lopes from previous engagements were pulled from official records. Albums that once bore their smiling faces at events beside Charles and Camilla were flagged. Archivists were given direct orders. No image, no mention, no trace was to be left in any future historical record. Royal historians called it unprecedented. Some were horrified. Others whispered in awe at the efficiency. It was as if a dynasty had blinked out of existence not through scandal or exile but by royal command. Even charities long associated with Camilla's children began facing internal reviews. Some had received royal backing for over a decade. Now, royal patronage was being reconsidered. Endorsements were frozen. Public appearances were cancelled. Donations dropped. The message was clear. The Windsor name was no longer a safety net for the Parker Bowles clan. Their royal connection was now a liability one the institution was desperate to distance itself from. Inside palace walls, some began calling it the Windsor Annihilation Order. It sounded brutal. It was meant to. Because the monarchy, once hesitant to act, was now reclaiming control with ruthless clarity. There would be no second chances, no apologies, no quiet re-entries through side doors. This was final. But as palace aides scrambled to enforce the erasure, Camilla wasn't the only one spiraling. Tom Parker Bowles was preparing to fight back. Tom Parker Bowles had always lived in the periphery of royalty. Never a prince, but never quite a commoner. He was the queen consort's son, a man granted proximity without power, presence without permanence. For years, he navigated the fine line between family and formality, attending events, advising on palace hospitality, and quietly enjoying the unspoken benefits of being Camilla's blood. But now, with a single decree, that delicate balance has shattered. The privileges were gone, the security stripped, the royal embrace turned cold, and what remained was rage raw, simmering, and dangerous. Tom wasn't just humiliated, he was furious. And in that fury, he found his resolve. If the monarchy wanted to erase him, he would make sure they remembered exactly who he was. According to sources close to the Parker Bowles circle, Tom wasted no time. Within 24 hours of the decree, he had initiated a string of covert communications with media executives and publishing contacts across London. Not with bombast, but with quiet intent. No press release, no interviews, just cryptic conversations and veiled suggestions. There's more to this family than the public knows, he allegedly told one editor. Another report hinted at the existence of an unpublished manuscript written over several years detailing his mother's ascension, the internal politics of Clarence House, and the emotional fractures that had long plagued King Charles and Camilla's marriage. It wasn't just gossip. These were secrets, intimate, personal, and potentially explosive. What had begun as whispers quickly spiraled into a full-blown royal crisis. Tom wasn't bluffing. He had access. He had memories. He had been in rooms where decisions were made, where confessions were uttered in drunken slurs or whispered tears, and now he was prepared to bring it all to light. From the early days of Camilla's re-entry into Charles's life to the tension-filled family dinners where William barely spoke a word, Tom had been there. observing, absorbing. And now, it seemed, he was ready to talk. The threat didn't go unnoticed. Palace officials scrambled to contain what they called a potential narrative disaster. Pressure mounted on King Charles to find a middle ground to prevent his private life from becoming tabloid fodder. Some insiders urged him to meet Tom privately to offer a symbolic gesture of peace. But Charles, still reeling from the confrontation with William and the collapse of Camilla's emotional state, was frozen. He knew any reconciliation would be perceived as weakness, worse compromise, and the monarchy could not afford that now. But William was unflinching. When advisors warned him that Tom was threatening to expose everything, his response was icy and direct. Let him try. For William, this was not just about controlling a media narrative, it was about drawing a line between the royal family and those who had only ever borrowed its power. He believed the crown had already conceded too much, and he would not allow emotional manipulation or public blackmail to reverse the course now set in stone. Tom's silence, however, was growing louder. His absence from public events, his sudden cancellation of appearances, the leaked hints about a tell-all that could redefine public opinion of the monarchy. All of it created a tension so thick, palace aides described the atmosphere as suffocating. Everyone was watching, waiting. Would he really detonate the monarchy's deepest secrets? Or was this all a calculated ploy to reclaim relevance? But as tensions reached a boiling point, one woman stepped forward not to defend Camilla, but to protect the crown from absolute collapse. While the royal court unraveled in whispers, threats, and emotional tremors, one figure stood like a fortress amid the chaos. Princess Anne. The woman often called the crown's quiet steel had stayed in the shadows long enough. But now, with Camilla's family erased, Tom Parker Bowles threatening to unleash secrets, and Charles visibly cracking under the pressure, Anne knew the monarchy needed something it was rapidly losing: clarity. She didn't step forward to defend Camilla or coddle her brother. She stepped forward to protect the crown itself, and she did so with the ruthless clarity of someone who understood the difference between duty and emotion. Because for Anne, the monarchy was never about feelings, it was about survival. At midnight, while most of the palace remained tense in silence, Anne requested a private audience with Charles, just the two of them. No aides, no advisors, no interruptions. And in that dimly lit room where royal history had too often been shaped behind closed doors, she made her message clear. "You must hold your line," she told him. "This isn't about your heart anymore. It's about the institution." Anne wasn't asking. She was warned. She had seen firsthand what happened when the crown compromised too much, when personal desire infected the institution's core. And now, Charles stood on the edge of that same slippery slope. If he bent, even slightly, the entire monarchy could buckle beneath the weight of perception. But Anne's sense of justice wasn't without compassion. She later requested a brief meeting with Camilla, one no one was to record or document. According to palace whispers, it was one of the most emotionally charged encounters in recent memory. Anne didn't shout. She didn't blame me. Instead, she looked Camilla in the eye and said, "You knew this day would come. It wasn't cruel. It was the truth." Camilla, for all her ambition and influence, had played the long game to secure her place beside Charles. But in doing so, she had ignored the invisible boundary that protected the crown's sanctity. And now, she was paying the price. Anne didn't offer a hand of rescue. She offered something far more painful than acceptance. Anne's influence didn't stop in private chambers. She took action where it mattered most on the public stage. Days after the decree, she made an unexpected appearance alongside King Charles at a charity event long associated with Queen Elizabeth. Cameras captured the image, but it wasn't the handshake or smiles that made headlines. It was the brooch. Anne wore the Queen Mother's sapphire and diamond brooch, a piece not seen in decades. It wasn't just jewelry. It was a symbol, a statement that the old guard was back, that tradition would endure, and that the monarchy, bruised and battered, was not broken. Behind the scenes, she worked to calm William. His resolve hadn't weakened, but the emotional toll was evident. Anne reminded him that leadership was not about revenge, it was about balance. Her presence steadied him, just as it steadied the public perception of the royal family. She became the glue holding fractured pieces together not with fanfare, but with quiet authority. She also reminded Charles of something he seemed to have forgotten, something Queen Elizabeth had once confided to her during one of their final conversations. That the greatest threat to the monarchy would never come from outside forces, but from those allowed too close without earning their place. That warning, long buried beneath family dynamics and modern politics, had now resurfaced like prophecy. Anne wasn't there to be adored, she was there to anchor. And in those moments, she became more than the Princess Royal. She became the monarchy's silent shield. But Anne's attempt to stabilize would only last so long because behind the gates of Buckingham, Camilla was preparing her final move. She had fought her entire life to be accepted not just by the public, but by the very family she now called her own. From whispers in corridors to venom in headlines, Camilla had endured decades of being branded the outsider, the usurper, the woman who stole what was never hers to claim. Yet against all odds, she rose beside Charles, beside the crown. But now, in the twilight of her triumph, it was all slipping away. And in the stillness of the royal gardens, stripped of title and shielded no longer by duty or tradition, Camilla stood before the man who had once promised her everything. She was no longer queen consort. She was a mother begging for mercy. "Don't punish my children for loving me," she whispered. It wasn't defiance, it was desperation. In that moment, Camilla let go of pretense. The grandeur, the posture, the quiet superiority that had once defined her presence, all of it crumbled. She didn't defend the decisions she had made, nor did she deny the influence her children had wielded under the shelter of her crown. Instead, she offered something far more difficult, a confession. "I pushed too hard," she admitted. "I see that now." Her voice, once firm and commanding, trembled. She had tried to build something lasting for her family. But in doing so, she had ignored the boundaries that royalty demanded and forgotten the line between love and legacy. The monarchy, she now understood, would never share its power. It would never split its blood. Charles stood before her, visibly shaken. The man who had once defied tradition, endured scandal, and altered history for her sake, now found himself cornered by the very consequences he'd helped unleash. He had not stopped the decree. He had not defended her children. And now, as Camilla begged him to reconsider, he was paralyzed. His eyes glistened, but his words were cold. The damage is already done. He wasn't speaking only of the past weeks, he was speaking of years. Of the delicate trust between crown and country that had been quietly eroded. Of the rising resentment inside his own bloodline. And of the monarchy, now under siege, clawing its way back toward order and tradition. Back inside the palace, Camilla's isolation had grown unbearable. Aides who once catered to her vanished. Longtime friends suddenly had no time. Invitations were withdrawn. The very walls that once offered her sanctuary now felt like a gilded prison. Even her private secretary, one of her fiercest defenders, resigned quietly, unwilling to be caught in the political fallout. Her world, once filled with influence and admiration, had become a void. In a final act of desperation, Camilla penned private appeals to Parliament members, invoking the monarchy's long history of inclusion, fairness, and forgiveness. She reminded them that the royal family had, time and again, made room for flawed humanity. But the responses were icy, polite, respectful, and entirely void of commitment. The political machinery had already moved on. Sympathy was not a strategy, and no one was willing to challenge the new royal order, not even for her. Public sentiment, meanwhile, began to shift, not toward forgiveness, but toward a strange, cold pity. Commentators noted the change in her appearance, the absence of her children, the silence from Clarence House. Social media overflowed with words like tragic and heartbreaking. But the nation, while moved by her unraveling, was unmoved in principle. They had not forgotten, they had simply stopped caring. And as Camilla retreated further into solitude, watching everything she had built fall piece by piece, the monarchy moved forward with surgical precision. But the final nail was still to be hammered by the people who once welcomed Camilla's family with open arms. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in the next one.